The carriage door swung open before Alice Bennet could stand, and a tall man in a dark gray coat stepped into the doorway of her family home without waiting to be announced. His eyes moved across the room, past her older sister Charlotte, past her father, and landed on her. "That one," he said. "I want her." The room went silent. Alice felt her heart drop into her stomach. Her father, Sir Edmund Bennet, rose from his chair so fast it scraped against the floor. "Your Grace, surely you mean my eldest daughter. Charlotte is the one who—" "I did not ask for the pretty one," the Duke said. His voice was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it, like a blade wrapped in silk. "I asked for her, the quiet one, the one nobody speaks of." Alice's hands went cold. She had spent her whole life being invisible in this house, and now, in the space of one sentence, she had become the most important person in the room. It did not feel like an honor. It felt like a trap closing. 2 weeks earlier, her father had made a deal with the Duke of Rathmore, William Hartley, over a piece of land that bordered both their estates. Sir Edmund had promised documents that proved the land was legally his to sell. Those documents, it turned out, were forged. The Duke had paid a large sum of money for land that was never truly his father's to give. When the truth came out, most men would have gone to the courts. Most men would have demanded money back, or blood, or public shame. William Hartley did none of these things. He rode to Bennet Hall himself, walked through the front door, and named his price. Not gold, not land, a wife. And not the daughter everyone expected him to choose. "You cannot be serious," Charlotte said, stepping forward with her chin lifted. She was used to being chosen. Men had been choosing her since she was 15 years old. "She barely speaks. She has no manners for society. She would embarrass you within a week." "I am not looking for someone to charm my dinner guests," the Duke said. "I am looking for someone who understands the value of a debt." Alice stood frozen by the window, her fingers pressed against the folds of her dress. She had heard every word, and yet none of it felt real. She had spent years learning how to disappear in rooms like this one. She ate quietly. She spoke only when spoken to. She had watched her father dote on Charlotte and barely remember her own name at the dinner table. Being unseen had kept her safe. It had also kept her forgotten. And now the most powerful man in the county was looking directly at her, and she did not know what frightened her more, being chosen or being seen. "I will not force her," the Duke said, though his tone made it clear that this was not truly a choice being offered. "But she comes with me tonight, or your family loses everything you own within the month. I have already spoken to my lawyers." Sir Edmund's face turned pale. He looked at Alice the way a man looks at a coin he is about to spend, not with love, with relief that it was not costing him more. "Alice," he said, "go and pack a bag." She did not cry. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing in this house, and arguing only made her father angrier. She walked up the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the banister, and in her room she packed only what mattered to her: 2 dresses, a pair of shoes, and a small wooden box that she wrapped in a shawl and held against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. When she came back down, the Duke was waiting by the door. He looked at the small bag in her hand, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, like he had expected more resistance and got none. "You are not going to beg your father to change his mind?" he asked. "Would it work?" Alice asked quietly. The Duke did not answer. That was answer enough. She followed him to the carriage. As it pulled away from the only home she had ever known, she did not look back. Charlotte stood on the steps, arms crossed, already turning to go back inside, already forgetting her sister existed. Their father stood beside her, already counting the debt he no longer owed. Alice sat across from the Duke in the carriage, her small wooden box in her lap, her spine straight, her face calm. Inside, her thoughts moved like a storm trapped in a bottle, but on the outside she gave him nothing. No fear, no tears, no pleading. "You are very quiet," the Duke said after a long silence. "You said that is why you chose me," Alice replied. He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were trying to read a book written in a language he did not know. "I chose you because your father valued you the least," he said. "I thought that would make you the easiest to control." Something in Alice's chest tightened, but her face did not change. "And now?" she asked. The Duke leaned back against the carriage seat, his eyes still on her. "Now I am not so certain," he said. The carriage rolled on through the darkening countryside, carrying her away from the house where she had spent 19 years disappearing, toward a future she had not chosen, sitting across from a man who thought he understood exactly who she was. He had no idea. Alice looked down at the wooden box in her lap and pressed her palm flat against its lid, the way she always did when the world felt too loud, or too quiet, or too much. Inside that box was the only proof that anyone had ever truly seen her, truly loved her, before the world decided she was easy to overlook. The Duke thought he had taken the weakest piece from the board. He had no idea what he had actually brought into his house. The wheels of the carriage turned steadily beneath them, carrying her toward Rathmore Manor, toward a marriage built on debt and revenge, toward a man who wanted a quiet, obedient wife to punish her father through her. But Alice Bennet had not survived 19 years of being invisible by being weak. She had survived it by becoming something far more dangerous. Someone who watched everything, said little, and remembered everyone who had ever failed her. The Duke would learn that soon enough. For now, she simply sat with her hands folded, her eyes on the passing fields, and let him believe whatever he wanted to believe. It was, after all, the only power she had left. The carriage slowed as it passed through a set of iron gates, and Alice caught her first sight of Rathmore Manor rising out of the darkness. It was larger than her family home by 3 times, with tall windows lit from within and a wide stone staircase leading up to double doors. She had heard stories about this place from servants who had visited, but nothing had prepared her for the size of it, or for the silence that seemed to hang over the grounds like a held breath. A row of staff stood waiting at the entrance, lanterns in hand, their faces carefully blank in the way trained servants learned to keep them. The Duke stepped down from the carriage first and offered his hand to help her out. Alice hesitated only a moment before taking it, her fingers brushing against his glove. "This is Mrs. Doyle," the Duke said, gesturing toward an older woman standing at the front of the group. "She runs the household. Whatever you need, she will see to it." Mrs. Doyle gave a short nod, her eyes moving over Alice with quiet assessment, the way a shopkeeper might examine a piece of fabric before deciding its worth. Alice did not flinch under the look. She had grown used to being measured by strangers. "Welcome to Rathmore, my lady," Mrs. Doyle said, though her tone carried more caution than warmth. Alice followed the Duke up the stone steps, her small bag in one hand and the wrapped wooden box tucked carefully under her other arm. Inside the entrance hall, the ceiling stretched high above her, painted with faded scenes of hunting parties and gardens. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. "You will marry within the week," the Duke said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "There is no reason to delay. The arrangement was made. It only needs to be made official." Alice stopped walking. "Within the week. Is that a problem?" She thought of Charlotte, who had spent months planning her own wedding, choosing flowers and fabric and guest lists. Alice would have none of that. She would simply be handed over again, this time with paperwork and a ring instead of a carriage ride. "No," she said, "it is not a problem." The Duke studied her for a long moment as if waiting for her voice to crack, for some sign of the fear he expected to find underneath her calm words. When none came, something flickered across his face that Alice could not quite name. Not quite respect, not quite confusion, something in between. "Mrs. Doyle will show you to your room," he said finally, and turned to walk away without another word. Alice watched him go, his boots echoing against the stone floor until he disappeared through a set of doors at the end of the hall. Only then did she let her shoulders drop, just slightly, just enough to breathe. Mrs. Doyle led her up a wide staircase and down a long corridor lined with closed doors. The room she was given was larger than any bedroom Alice had ever slept in, with tall windows overlooking a dark garden and a bed with more pillows than she knew what to do with. "If you need anything, my lady, ring the bell by the door," Mrs. Doyle said, already turning to leave. "Mrs. Doyle," Alice said, stopping her, "why does he want a wife he did not choose for love?" The older woman paused, her hand on the doorframe. For a moment, Alice thought she would not answer at all. "His Grace does not do things without reason," Mrs. Doyle said carefully. "Whether you understand that reason is not my place to explain." She left before Alice could ask anything else, and the door clicked shut behind her, leaving Alice alone in a room far too large for one quiet, unwanted bride. She set her bag down on the bed and unwrapped the wooden box from its shawl, placing it gently on the small table beside the window. She did not open it. She never opened it in front of others, not even alone in a room, not on the first night in a place that still felt like enemy territory. She simply rested her hand on top of it, the way she always did, and let the weight of the day settle into her bones. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the garden, and somewhere below, she thought she heard the low sound of a man's voice, sharp with frustration, speaking to someone she could not see. She moved closer to the window and looked down, but the garden was empty, the sound perhaps carried from somewhere deeper inside the house. She did not know yet what kind of man William Hartley truly was. She only knew what he had shown her so far, a man who took what he believed he was owed, who spoke in short, controlled sentences, who watched her the way a hunter watches something he has not yet decided is prey or something else entirely. Alice changed out of her traveling dress and sat by the window long after the house had gone quiet, her hand still resting on the wooden box, her mind turning over every look the Duke had given her since he walked through her family's door. She had come to Rathmore Manor as a debt paid in full, but something told her that debts were rarely as simple as the men who collected them believed them to be. Tomorrow, she would begin the strange task of becoming a duchess in a house that did not want her, married to a man who thought he understood exactly what he had bought. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the carriage door had opened that afternoon, she allowed herself one single tear, quiet and private, the only kind she had ever permitted herself. Then she wiped it away, straightened her spine, and went to sleep. The wedding took place on a gray morning in the manor's private chapel, attended by no more than a dozen people. There were no flowers chosen by Alice, no guest list of her own, no family present except a cousin of the Duke's who signed as a witness, and left before the ceremony breakfast had even finished. Alice wore a plain blue dress that Mrs. Doyle had found for her, and she stood at the altar beside a man she had known for exactly 9 days. William Hartley said his vows in the same steady voice he used for everything else, as if he were confirming a business arrangement rather than promising a lifetime. Alice matched his tone, word for word, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, neither of them reached for the other's hand. That evening, at a dinner meant to mark the occasion, Alice sat at the long table across from her new husband, a distance of nearly 10 feet between them, with silver dishes and candlelight filling the space where conversation should have been. "You have not asked me a single question since you arrived," William said, breaking the silence. Alice looked up from her plate. "What would you like me to ask?" "Most women would want to know about their new household, their allowance, their position among the staff." "I assumed you would tell me what you wanted me to know," Alice said. "Asking questions in my father's house rarely earned me answers. It only earned me trouble." Something shifted behind William's eyes, quick and unreadable, gone before Alice could name it. "This is not your father's house," he said. "No," Alice agreed, "it is yours." The days that followed fell into a strange, careful rhythm. Alice rose early, before the rest of the household stirred, and spent her mornings walking the halls of Rathmore Manor, learning its shape the way she had once learned the shape of silence in her father's home. She discovered that the West Wing held a library untouched by dust, its shelves heavy with books no one seemed to read. She discovered that the kitchen staff whispered about their master behind closed doors, calling him fair but distant, a man who paid well and asked little conversation in return. She discovered, too, that the household accounts were kept in poor order, columns of numbers scratched out and rewritten, expenses recorded twice or not at all. On her fifth morning as Duchess, she asked Mrs. Doyle for the ledger books, and by the following week she had reorganized them entirely, her small, neat handwriting replacing the messy scrawl of whoever had kept them before. William found her at this task one evening, candle burned low, ink stains on her fingers, the ledger spread open across the desk in the small study she had claimed as her own. "You did not need to do this," he said from the doorway. Alice did not look up. Someone did. "I have a man for the accounts." "Your man for the accounts has cost you nearly £40 this year in errors alone," Alice said, still writing. "Unless you wanted to keep losing money, someone needed to fix it." William crossed the room and looked over her shoulder at the neat rows of numbers, the corrected totals, the small notes she had written in the margins explaining each change. He was quiet for a long moment. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My mother kept our household accounts before she died," Alice said. "I used to sit beside her while she worked. It was the only time she was not tired, not sad. Numbers made sense to her when nothing else did." She stopped speaking abruptly, as if she had said more than she meant to, and closed the ledger with a quiet snap. "You should rest," William said. "It is late." Alice rose from the desk, gathering the papers into a neat stack, and as she reached for the candle to carry it back to her room, William's hand closed briefly over hers on the desk, not gripping, just resting there for a moment. Alice went still, not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of someone whose body had learned long ago that stillness was safer than flinching, safer than pulling away, safer than reacting at all. William noticed it, the way her breath caught and held, the way her eyes fixed on some point past his shoulder rather than on his face. He pulled his hand back. "Good night, Alice," he said, and left the room without another word. Alice stood alone in the study for a long time after he had gone, her hand still resting where his had been, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She did not understand the feeling that had moved through her in that moment, sharp and unfamiliar, something between fear and something else entirely. She carried the candle back to her room and set it on the table beside her bed, and before she lay down, she reached for the wooden box, as she did every night, resting her palm against its lid until her breathing slowed. Days turned into weeks, and the household began to notice a change in its master. William Hartley, who had always eaten alone, began appearing at the dinner table each evening without fail. He began asking Mrs. Doyle whether the new Duchess had eaten enough, whether she had slept well, whether the fire in her room had been kept lit through the cold nights. He never asked Alice these things directly. He simply began making certain, quietly, that they were true. Alice noticed these small changes and said nothing about them, though she filed each one away carefully, the way she filed away everything, waiting to understand what they meant. One evening in early autumn, a fire broke out in the east wing of the manor, started by a fallen candle in an unused sitting room. The alarm spread through the house in shouts and running footsteps, servants forming lines with buckets from the well, smoke curling out from beneath a closed door. Alice woke to the smell of it before anyone came to warn her, and her first thought, clear and immediate, was not of her own safety. It was of the wooden box, sitting on the table beside her window, the only thing in the entire manor that truly belonged to her. She was out of bed and moving before she had fully decided to move. She grabbed the shawl from her chair and wrapped it around her shoulders, coughing as smoke began to seep beneath her own door from the corridor. Outside, she could hear shouting, the clatter of buckets, Mrs. Doyle's voice rising above the chaos, directing servants toward the well. Alice pressed the wooden box against her chest and moved toward the door, but the corridor beyond was thick with gray smoke, thicker than she had expected, stinging her eyes and filling her lungs with every breath. She pushed forward anyway, one hand against the wall to guide her, the other holding the box so tightly her knuckles had gone white. A voice called her name from somewhere ahead, sharp with alarm. "Alice!" William appeared through the smoke, his shirt open at the collar, his face streaked with soot. He grabbed her arm the moment he reached her, pulling her back the way he had come. "What are you doing? You should be outside with the others." "I had to get something," Alice said, coughing between words. William looked down at the small wooden box clutched against her chest, and for a moment, something like disbelief crossed his face. "You went back into a burning house for a box." "Yes," Alice said, and there was no apology in her voice, only a flat, exhausted certainty. He did not argue further. There was no time. He pulled her down the corridor, one arm wrapped firmly around her shoulders, guiding her through the smoke toward the main staircase, where the air grew clearer with every step. By the time they reached the entrance hall, servants were already forming a line to pass buckets of water toward the east wing, and the fire, though frightening, had not yet spread beyond the one sitting room where it began. Outside on the front steps, the cold night air hit Alice's lungs like relief, and she bent forward, coughing hard, the box still held tightly in one arm. William knelt beside her, his hand resting on her back, not speaking, simply steadying her until the coughing eased. "You are shaking," he said quietly. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You just ran into a burning building for a box the size of a loaf of bread." Alice straightened, wiping soot from her cheek with the back of her hand, and looked at him directly, something fierce and tired in her eyes. "It is not just a box," she said. William studied her for a long moment, and Alice braced herself for the question she knew was coming, the question everyone eventually asked, the one she had spent years avoiding. But instead, he simply nodded once and did not press further. "Come inside," he said instead. "Away from the smoke, Mrs. Doyle will have tea brought to the drawing room." Alice let him lead her back inside, past servants still working to douse the last of the flames in the ruined sitting room, past Mrs. Doyle, who cast a worried glance her way and immediately called for warm water and clean cloths. Alice sat on a settee in the drawing room, the wooden box now resting safely in her lap, her hands finally still. William sat across from her, watching the way her fingers traced the edge of the box's lid without opening it, the way her whole body seemed to relax slightly the moment it was safely back in her possession. "You do not have to tell me what is inside it," he said after a while, "but I would like to understand why it matters so much." Alice looked at the box for a long time before she answered. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its usual careful control. "It is all I have," she said, "of her of before." She did not explain further, and William did not ask her to. He simply sat with her in the quiet drawing room while the smell of smoke faded from the air, while the household slowly settled back into order beyond the closed door. And for the first time since she had arrived at Rathmore Manor, Alice did not feel entirely alone in her silence. Mrs. Doyle arrived with tea a short while later, and behind her carefully composed expression, Alice caught a flicker of something new in the housekeeper's eyes when she looked between the Duke and his wife, sitting closer together than they had at any point since the wedding. "The fire is out, Your Grace," Mrs. Doyle reported. "No one was hurt. The sitting room will need repair, but the rest of the house is untouched." "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle," William said, his eyes still on Alice. "See that everyone is settled for the night." When the housekeeper left them alone again, William reached for the teapot and poured 2 cups, setting one on the small table beside Alice without a word. She wrapped her hands around the warm porcelain and finally allowed her shoulders to drop, the tension of the night slowly draining out of her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming to find me." "You are my wife," William said simply, as if that explained everything, though Alice understood there was more beneath the words than either of them was ready to say aloud. She drank her tea in silence, the wooden box still resting against her side, and outside the window the last traces of smoke drifted up into the dark autumn sky, carrying with them the first small crack in the careful walls Alice Bennet had spent her whole life building around herself. Neither of them spoke of the fire again in the days that followed, but something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, the way ice shifts beneath the surface of a frozen lake long before anyone sees the crack appear. William found himself thinking about the wooden box far more often than he wanted to admit. It followed him through his days, into meetings with his steward, into long rides across the estate, into quiet evenings alone in his study with a glass of untouched brandy. A woman did not run into a burning building for a box of trinkets. She ran into a burning building for something that felt to her like the last piece of a person she had lost. He began to watch Alice more carefully after that night, not with suspicion, but with a kind of attention he had never given anyone before. He noticed the way she counted the days on a small calendar she kept in her desk, marking certain dates with a faint pencil line and nothing else. He noticed the way she grew quieter than usual whenever her father's name was mentioned by a visiting neighbor. He noticed the way she flinched, just slightly, whenever a man raised his voice in frustration, even when the anger had nothing to do with her at all. He did not ask her about any of it directly. He had learned, in the weeks since the fire, that direct questions made Alice retreat further into her careful silence. Instead, he began asking others. He started with Mrs. Doyle, who had once served briefly in a neighboring household years before coming to Rathmore, a household not far from the Bennet estate. "Did you know the Bennet family before Alice came here?" William asked one afternoon, finding the housekeeper in the linen room, counting fresh sheets into neat stacks. Mrs. Doyle paused, her hands going still over the folded linen. "A little, Your Grace. Everyone in the county knew of them." "What do you know of the daughters?" "The eldest, Miss Charlotte, was always spoken of highly. Beautiful, charming, the pride of her father's house." Mrs. Doyle hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "The younger daughter was spoken of far less. Some said she was simple. Others said she had never recovered from her mother's death." "How did her mother die?" "I could not say for certain, Your Grace. It happened suddenly when Lady Alice was still quite young. There were whispers at the time, though I never learned the truth of them. Whispers of illness, whispers of something less natural. The family closed ranks quickly and never spoke of it again." William felt something tighten in his chest at the words, an unfamiliar protectiveness he did not fully understand. "And after her mother died?" Mrs. Doyle glanced toward the door, as if checking they were truly alone, before continuing. "I heard, from a maid who once worked at Bennet Hall, that the young lady changed after that. Stopped speaking much at all for a time. Her father had little patience for grief that did not resolve itself quickly, and less patience still for a daughter who reminded him too much of the wife he had lost." William said nothing for a long moment, turning the information over carefully, fitting it against everything he had already observed. A mother lost too suddenly. A father who preferred forgetting to remembering. A sister who had learned, early and thoroughly, that being unseen was safer than being noticed by a man who did not want reminders of his grief walking through his house. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle," he said finally. "I would ask that you keep this conversation between us." "Of course, Your Grace." He left the linen room with more questions than he had arrived with, and that evening he found himself standing outside Alice's study door longer than he intended, listening to the quiet scratch of her pen against paper before finally knocking and letting himself in. Alice looked up from the ledger she had been working on, her expression carefully neutral, the way it always was when she did not yet know what mood he had brought into the room with him. "I wanted to see how you were," William said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were only half true. "I am well," Alice said, setting down her pen. "The accounts are nearly balanced for the quarter." "That is not what I meant." Alice's hands stilled on the desk. She looked at him carefully, as if trying to read what he already knew, what he might be about to ask. William saw the exact moment her guard rose, the small shift in her posture, the careful straightening of her spine. "I am well," she repeated, more firmly this time. He did not push. He had learned that much already. Instead, he crossed the room and took the seat across from her desk, the same seat he had taken the night of the fire, and simply sat with her in silence for a while, watching the candlelight flicker across the pages of the ledger. "My mother used to sit like that," he said eventually, nodding toward the way Alice's hand rested against the edge of the desk, fingers curled slightly inward, when she was worried about something she did not want to say aloud. Alice glanced down at her own hand, as if noticing the habit for the first time. "Your mother," she said carefully, "you have never spoken of her." "She died when I was 12. My father remarried within the year, to a woman who had little interest in a son who was not her own." William's voice was steady, but Alice heard something beneath it, something old and carefully managed, not unlike the way she herself spoke of her own family. "I understand, perhaps more than you realize, what it is to grow up in a house that decides you are easier to forget than to grieve properly." Alice looked at him for a long moment, something shifting behind her careful expression, a small crack of recognition passing between them. "I did not know that," she said quietly. "Few people do. It is not the sort of thing a duke shares easily." William met her eyes across the desk. "But I thought, perhaps, you might understand it better than most." Alice did not answer right away. She looked down at the ledger in front of her, then at her own hands, then finally back at him, and for the first time since she had arrived at Rathmore Manor, she allowed a small, honest piece of herself to show through the careful walls she had built. "My mother died when I was 10, she said. "My father never spoke of her again after the funeral, not once. It was as though she had never existed at all, except that I looked too much like her for him to ever quite forget." William stayed very still, sensing that any wrong movement might close the door she had just opened. "Charlotte looks like our father's family," Alice continued, her voice quiet but steady. "I look like my mother did. He could not look at me without seeing her, and he could not bear to see her, so he simply stopped looking at me at all." The room was silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. William did not offer sympathy he suspected she did not want. He did not press her for more than she had already given. He simply nodded, once, acknowledging what she had shared without demanding she explain further. "Thank you for telling me that," he said. Alice gave a small, tired smile, the first genuine smile William had seen from her since her arrival. "I do not know why I told you at all. Perhaps because I did not ask you to." She considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if it made more sense than she expected it to. Over the following weeks, small moments like this one began to accumulate between them. Quiet exchanges over dinner, shared silences in the study that no longer felt uncomfortable, a growing familiarity that neither of them named aloud, but both of them noticed. William found himself looking forward to the evenings when Alice would join him by the fire, her needlework or her ledgers in hand, content simply to exist in the same room as him without the pressure of constant conversation. He noticed, too, the way she had begun opening the wooden box in the evenings, not fully, not enough for him to see what was inside, but enough to take something small out, read it, and put it carefully back before closing the lid again. He never asked what it was. He had a growing suspicion, born from Mrs. Doyle's careful words and Alice's own quiet confession, but he did not want to force the discovery before Alice was ready to offer it herself. One evening, As autumn deepened into the first cold edges of winter, Alice sat by the fire with the box open in her lap, and for the first time, she did not close it when William entered the room. She looked up at him, hesitated only a moment, and then, wordlessly, turned the box slightly so that the firelight caught the edge of a folded piece of paper resting inside. "It is a letter," she said quietly. "From my mother. She wrote it not long before she died. I do not know if she meant to give it to me, or if I simply found it after and kept it because it was the last thing in her handwriting I had left." William did not move closer, did not reach for the letter, understanding instinctively that this was not an invitation to read it, only an invitation to know it existed. "Have you read it many times?" he asked gently. "More than I could count." Alice's fingers traced the edge of the folded paper without opening it further. "I have never finished it, though. There is a line partway through that I have never been able to read past." William waited, saying nothing, giving her the space to continue or to stop as she chose. "I am afraid," Alice said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "that if I finish it there will be nothing left of her to discover. That the letter will end, and she will truly be gone instead of just gone the way she has been gone all these years, with something still waiting for me to find." The fire crackled softly in the silence that followed her words. William watched her carefully close the box once more, tucking the unfinished letter back inside, and something in his chest ached in a way he did not fully understand, a protectiveness that had grown, slowly and without his full notice, into something closer to tenderness. He did not tell her that night that he intended to learn more about her mother's death, about the whispers Mrs. Doyle had mentioned, about the shadow that had followed Alice out of her father's house and into his own. He simply sat with her by the fire, letting the quiet stretch comfortably between them, and resolved, silently, that whatever truth was waiting to be uncovered, Alice would not have to face it alone. The following week, William rode out under the excuse of estate business, though his true destination was a small cottage on the edge of the county, where an old woman named Grace Turner lived alone with her chickens and her memories. Grace had once served as a lady's maid at Bennett Hall, before Alice was even born, and had stayed on through the early years of her mother's marriage before retiring to her cottage many years ago. She welcomed William with the nervous formality of someone unused to visits from dukes, offering him tea in a chipped cup and apologizing for the state of her small kitchen. William assured her the visit was informal, and after a few minutes of careful conversation about the weather and the harvest, he asked the question he had truly come to ask. "You knew Lady Margaret Bennet well, I understand, Alice's mother." Grace's hands, which had been fussing with the teapot, went still. "I did, Your Grace. A kinder woman never lived. It was a tragedy, what happened to her." "What did happen to her?" Grace glanced toward the door, as if half expecting someone to be listening before lowering her voice. "The official word was illness, a fever that took her quickly. But I was in that house the week before she died, Your Grace, and I saw no fever. I saw a woman who had grown thinner every month for a year, who flinched whenever her husband raised his voice, who confided in me once, late at night when she thought no one else could hear, that she feared what would become of her daughters if anything happened to her." William's grip tightened slightly around his teacup. "Are you suggesting Sir Edmund had some hand in his wife's death?" "I am suggesting nothing so bold as that, Your Grace. I have no proof of anything, only an old woman's memory and a feeling that never quite left me." Grace's eyes grew distant, remembering. "But I know that Lady Margaret was writing a letter in her final days, one she made me promise to keep safe should anything happen to her, meant for her younger daughter when she was old enough to understand it. I gave it to Alice myself, the week after the funeral when no one else was watching. She was only 10 years old, and she held it like it was made of glass." William set down his teacup carefully, his mind working quickly to fit this new piece into everything he already knew. "Do you know what the letter said?" "I never read it, Your Grace. It was not mine to read. But I know Lady Margaret spent her final weeks trying to put into words everything she feared she would not live long enough to say aloud. Whatever is written in that letter, I imagine it carries more truth about that family than anyone still living would care to admit." William thanked Grace Turner for her time and rode back to Rathmore Manor with a heavier heart than he had carried in years, turning over everything he had learned, understanding now with painful clarity the shape of the silence Alice had carried with her for nearly a decade. A mother who had likely suffered far more than a simple fever. A father who had buried the truth along with his wife and punished his younger daughter for carrying too much of her mother's face, her mother's memory, into every room she entered. He did not confront Alice with what he had learned. He was not yet certain enough of the full truth to burden her with half-formed suspicions, and he understood, with the same instinct that had guided him through every careful conversation since the fire, that Alice would need to arrive at whatever truth waited for her on her own terms, in her own time. But something had shifted in him during that quiet conversation with Grace Turner, a resolve settling into place alongside the growing tenderness he could no longer pretend not to feel. He had married Alice Bennet as an act of revenge against a man who had wronged him. He found himself now determined to become something else to her entirely, a man who would help her carry a weight she had been carrying alone since she was 10 years old, whether or not she ever asked him to. That evening he found her in the drawing room, the wooden box closed beside her on the settee, her needlework forgotten in her lap as she stared into the fire with an expression he had come to recognize as the one she wore when her thoughts had traveled somewhere he could not follow. He sat beside her without a word, closer than he usually allowed himself, and after a long moment, Alice's head tilted slightly until it rested against his shoulder, a small, wordless gesture of trust that neither of them acknowledged aloud. They stayed that way until the fire burned low, and though neither spoke of mothers or letters or the truths that waited to be uncovered, both of them understood, in the quiet warmth of that shared silence, that something had changed between them that could not be undone. An invitation arrived in early winter for a grand ball hosted by Lord and Lady Fenwick, the kind of event that drew every notable family in the county under one roof. William would have declined on Alice's behalf without a second thought, sensing that crowded rooms full of watching eyes were not where his quiet wife felt most at ease. But Alice surprised him by insisting they attend. "If I hide from every room that might contain my family, I will spend the rest of my life hiding," she said, folding the invitation with a steadiness that did not quite reach her eyes. "I would rather face it once properly than flinch every time an invitation arrives." William agreed, though he made a private decision to stay close to her side for the entire evening. The ballroom at Fenwick House was bright with candlelight and crowded with silk and laughter when they arrived, and Alice felt the familiar weight of being watched settle over her shoulders the moment they stepped through the doors. Whispers followed them, not loud enough to be rude, but not quiet enough to be missed. The quiet Bennet daughter made a duchess. Some called it fortune. Others, judging by the careful way certain eyes moved over her plain gown and unremarkable jewelry, called it something closer to pity. She held William's arm and kept her chin level, exactly as she had practiced in the mirror that afternoon, and for the first hour of the evening it worked. She smiled at the correct moments, answered questions with brief, careful politeness, and stayed close enough to William that his presence formed a kind of shield around her. Then Charlotte arrived. Her sister swept into the ballroom in a gown of deep emerald silk, drawing eyes the way she always had, laughing brightly at something said by the gentleman on her arm. It took less than 20 minutes for Charlotte to make her way toward Alice and William, her smile bright and sharp as broken glass. "Alice," Charlotte said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "How wonderful! I almost did not recognize you in a proper gown. I had heard the Duke kept you rather occupied with household ledgers these days. How very practical of him, marrying a woman better suited to counting linens than dancing." A few nearby guests laughed softly. the kind of laughter that pretended not to be cruel while doing exactly the damage it intended. Alice felt the old, familiar tightness rise in her chest, the instinct to shrink, to disappear, to let the words land and say nothing in return, exactly as she had done for 19 years in her father's house. Her hands curled slightly at her sides. "I understand it must be strange for you, Charlotte," William said before Alice could respond, his voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the surrounding chatter. "To watch a sister you once overlooked become far more valued than you ever imagined possible. I assure you, the household ledgers are only the smallest measure of what my wife is capable of managing. She has proven herself sharper, steadier, and infinitely more worth knowing than anyone in your family ever gave her credit for." The laughter around them died instantly. Charlotte's smile faltered, color rising in her cheeks as several guests exchanged quiet, interested glances. "I only meant," Charlotte began. "I know precisely what you meant," William said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And I would ask that you not mean it again in my wife's presence or in mine." Charlotte's mouth opened and closed once before she turned and walked away without another word, her earlier laughter nowhere to be found. The surrounding guests slowly returned to their own conversations, though not without a few final curious glances toward Alice, whose face had gone carefully, deliberately blank. William turned to her immediately, his hand finding hers. "Are you well?" "Yes," Alice said, though her voice was tighter than usual. "Thank you." They left the ball not long after, William citing a headache on Alice's behalf that fooled no one but drew no further comment. In the carriage on the ride home, Alice sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window at the dark passing fields. William watched her carefully, recognizing the particular quality of her silence, the way her jaw had set in a hard, controlled line. "You do not have to pretend you are unaffected," he said quietly. Alice's hands tightened in her lap. "I am not pretending." "Alice." The single word, gentle but insistent, seemed to crack something loose in her. Her shoulders, which had been held so carefully upright all evening, suddenly dropped, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed entirely, sharper, harder, carrying 19 years of swallowed anger finally finding a way out. "Do you know what it is like," she said, "to grow up watching someone else get chosen again and again for absolutely nothing more than being easier to love? I did not fail to earn my father's attention. I simply looked too much like the wife he wanted to forget. Charlotte did nothing to deserve the attention she received either. She simply did not remind him of anything painful." Her hands curled into fists against her skirt. "And I am so tired, William. I am so tired of being angry about something I could never have changed." The anger in her voice was familiar to her in a way William had not expected, steady and controlled even in its intensity, the anger of someone who had reached for it many times before, a tool worn smooth from years of careful use. It was not rage. It was relief, the sweet, dangerous relief of finally letting something out that had been pressed down for far too long. William said nothing, letting her finish, letting the anger burn through her without trying to smother it or soothe it too quickly. When Alice finally fell silent, her breathing still uneven, she looked down at her hands as if surprised by what had just come out of her. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "You did not need to hear all of that." "I am glad I did," William said. "You have carried it alone long enough." Alice looked up at him, something raw and unguarded in her expression, and reached into the small bag she carried, withdrawing the wooden box she had brought with her that evening, tucked carefully beneath her wrap without William's notice. She opened the lid. Inside, resting on a folded square of faded blue fabric, was a single sheet of paper, its ink slightly faded, its folds worn soft from years of careful handling. Alice lifted it from the box with trembling fingers and, for the first time in 9 years, unfolded it completely. "I have never read past the third line," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always stopped there. I do not know if I can finish it tonight either, but I wanted you to know it exists, all of it, not just the piece I have let myself see before." William did not reach for the letter, understanding that this moment belonged entirely to Alice. He simply sat beside her in the quiet carriage, close enough that she could feel his presence without being crowded by it, and waited. Alice's eyes moved down the page, past the line she always stopped at, further than she had ever allowed herself to go before. Her breath caught somewhere in the middle of the letter, and a single tear traced down her cheek, followed by another, silent and unhurried. She did not finish it that night. She folded it carefully before reaching the end, her hands shaking, and returned it to its box, closing the lid with the same careful reverence she always used. "Not yet," she said softly, more to herself than to William, "but soon." William reached over and took her hand, and this time Alice did not go still with old fear. She simply let her fingers curl around his, and together they rode the rest of the way home in a silence that, for the first time, felt like comfort rather than protection. In the days following the ball, Alice found herself changed in small, quiet ways she had not expected. She no longer flinched when a servant raised their voice across the courtyard to call to another. She no longer counted the days on her calendar in the same careful, private silence, marking them instead with small notes about the ordinary business of running a household, a life slowly filling in around the edges of old grief rather than being defined entirely by it. William, for his part, could not let go of what he had learned from Grace Turner, nor of the fierce, fragile honesty Alice had shown him in the carriage that night. He began making careful inquiries through his solicitor, requesting records from the county registrar regarding the circumstances of Lady Margaret Bennet's death nearly 9 years earlier. What came back was thin, official, and unsatisfying, a death certificate citing fever, signed by a physician who had, records showed, been paid an unusually generous sum by Sir Edmund Bennet in the same month his wife died. It was not proof of anything criminal. William understood that much clearly, but it was enough to confirm what Grace Turner's memory had suggested, that something in the official story did not sit easily against the truth, that a desperate man with debts of his own might have found it convenient to quiet a physician's questions with coin rather than answers. He did not share these findings with Alice immediately. He wanted to be certain first, wanted to understand the full shape of what he was dealing with before placing another weight on shoulders that had only just begun to straighten under the relief of finally being seen. Instead, he focused his attention on something more immediate, something he could act on without waiting for further confirmation. He reviewed, carefully and thoroughly, every document related to the original land dispute that had brought Alice into his life in the first place, the forged papers Sir Edmund had used to sell him land that was never legally his to sell. What he found, buried beneath the fraud that had already cost Sir Edmund his daughter, was evidence of a far larger pattern, other transactions, other forged documents, other debts quietly buried across the county over the better part of a decade. Sir Edmund Bennet had built the appearance of a respectable household on a foundation of careful lies, each one covering the last, stretching back, William suspected, to whatever truth had been buried alongside his wife. William brought his findings to Alice on a cold evening in late winter, choosing his words carefully as they sat together in the study that had become, over the months, as much hers as his. "I have not told you everything I have learned since the night of the ball," he said. "I did not want to burden you before I was certain of what I was telling you." Alice set down her needlework, her expression steady, though William could see the careful bracing beneath her calm. "Tell me now," she said. He did, laying out everything as plainly as he could, the conversation with Grace Turner, the death certificate and the physician's unusual payment, the pattern of forged documents stretching back years before the land deal that had brought her to Rathmore Manor. He watched her carefully as he spoke, ready to stop at any sign that the weight of it was too much. But Alice simply listened, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed somewhere past his shoulder. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "I always knew something was wrong," Alice said finally, her voice very soft. "I was only 10 years old, but I remember the way the house felt in those final weeks before she died. I remember my father's voice through the walls, arguing with someone late at night. I remember being told not to ask questions and being too frightened to ask them anyway. I am not certain we will ever have proof enough to bring your father before a magistrate," William said carefully. "But I do not intend to let him continue believing his lies are safe forever. There are other ways to see justice done." Alice looked at him then, something steady and resolved settling into her expression, replacing the fragile uncertainty that had lived there for so long. "I want to be there," she said, "when you confront him, whatever form that confrontation takes. I have spent my whole life being spoken about, decided upon, handled by other people as though I had no voice of my own. I will not be handled this time." William studied her for a long moment, seeing in her steady gaze the same quiet strength that had carried her through a burning corridor for a small wooden box, through a ballroom full of cruel whispers, through 19 years of being unseen without ever once breaking entirely. "Then you shall be there," he said, "and you shall speak for yourself exactly as much as you choose to." Alice nodded once, a small, determined motion, and reached for the wooden box resting on the table beside her chair. She did not open it that evening, but she rested her hand against its lid the way she always did, and for the first time, the gesture looked less like seeking comfort from something fragile and more like drawing strength from something she had finally decided to protect on her own terms, rather than hide. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, quiet and steady against the dark windows of Rathmore Manor, and inside, in the warm glow of the study fire, a plan began to take shape between them, one built not on revenge alone, but on the slow, deliberate work of finally bringing the truth into the light. Sir Edmund Bennet received word that the Duke and Duchess of Rathmore intended to call on him a fortnight before spring, and by the anxious state of the household when their carriage arrived at Bennet Hall, it was clear the visit had not been welcomed so much as endured. Alice stepped down from the carriage into the same front garden she had left nearly a year before, and found it smaller than she remembered. The grand house of her childhood shrunk somehow by everything she had learned to survive within its walls. Charlotte answered the door herself, her earlier confidence noticeably absent, her eyes darting between Alice and William with a wariness that had not existed the last time they met. "Father is in his study," Charlotte said, stepping back to let them enter. "He has been expecting you, though I confess he did not say why." Sir Edmund rose from behind his desk when they entered, his smile the practiced, careful smile of a man accustomed to charming his way past difficulty. It faltered the moment William placed a folder of documents on the desk between them without a word of greeting. "What is this?" Sir Edmund asked, though his eyes, scanning the top page, suggested he already suspected the answer. "A record of every forged land transaction you have arranged over the past decade," William said, "along with a rather interesting record of payment made to a physician in the same month your wife died of a fever no one else in the household ever caught." The color drained from Sir Edmund's face. He looked up sharply at Alice, who stood beside William with her chin level and her hands steady at her sides, none of the trembling girl who had once packed her bag without argument remaining in the woman who now met his eyes directly. "Alice," Sir Edmund began, his voice attempting the same commanding tone he had always used with her, "whatever your husband believes he has found, I assure you—" "I'm not here to hear your assurances," Alice said, and her voice, though quiet, filled the room in a way it never had before. "I am here because I spent 19 years believing I was unworthy of your attention, that I had somehow failed to earn a place in this family simply by existing. I have since learned that the failure was never mine. It was yours." Sir Edmund's mouth opened, but no defense came. Alice continued, her voice steady, years of unspoken words finally finding their way into the light. I do not know exactly what happened to my mother in her final weeks, and perhaps I never will with full certainty. But I know she was afraid, and I know you paid a man to make her death easier to explain than it should have been to explain. I know you looked at me every day for 9 years and saw only a reminder of a woman you wished to forget, and you punished me for a resemblance I never chose. That is not, Sir Edmund started. I am not finished, Alice said, and something in her tone silenced him completely. William has enough evidence of your forgeries to ruin you entirely, should he choose to bring them before a magistrate. He will not do so today. Not because you deserve mercy, but because I have decided that spending one more moment of my life focused on your punishment is a moment I would rather spend building something better with the family I have chosen instead of the one I was born into. She paused, letting the silence stretch, watching her father's careful composure crumble entirely under the weight of words he had never once expected to hear from his quiet, forgotten daughter. You will sign over the deed to the eastern parcel of land you attempted to sell fraudulently to my husband, at no further cost, as the debt should always have been settled honestly. And you will never contact me again unless I choose myself to reach out to you first. If either of those conditions is broken, the documents on your desk will find their way to the magistrate within the week. Sir Edmund looked between his daughter and the Duke, understanding fully now that there was no argument left available to him, no charm capable of undoing what had just been laid so plainly before him. He signed the papers William produced with a shaking hand, and neither Alice nor William stayed long enough afterward to hear whatever excuses he might have tried to offer in the silence that followed. Charlotte caught Alice's arm briefly as they left, her expression caught somewhere between shame and genuine uncertainty. I did not know, Charlotte said quietly. About Mother, I truly did not know. I believe you, Alice said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it. I do not think either of us was ever given the full truth of what happened in this house. I hope, in time, you find your own way to peace with it, whatever that looks like for you. She did not offer forgiveness beyond that, nor did Charlotte ask for it. It was enough for now that the conversation had happened honestly, without cruelty on either side. The carriage ride back to Rathmore Manor passed mostly in comfortable silence, Alice's hand resting easily in William's, the weight of 19 years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders in slow, steady degrees. When they arrived home, William led her not to the study or the drawing room, but to a small workshop near the stables where he kept tools for repairing furniture and fittings around the estate. On the workbench sat the wooden box, its familiar shape now fitted with a small brass lock and hinge, gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. I had it fitted while we were away, William said. I thought perhaps it was time it had a proper lock, something only you could open. He handed her a small brass key, cool and light in her palm. Everything in there is yours, he said, including the parts you have not shown me yet. I do not need to see all of it to understand how much it matters. I only wanted you to know that whatever you choose to keep private will always be safe in this house with me. Alice turned the key over in her fingers, then looked up at William with an expression he had never quite seen on her before, something open and unguarded and entirely without fear. I finished the letter, she said quietly, 2 nights ago while you were reviewing the estate accounts. I did not tell you because I was not certain yet what to do with what I found. William waited, saying nothing, letting her choose her own pace. She knew, Alice said. My mother. She knew she was running out of time, and she wrote that letter hoping I would grow up strong enough to survive whatever came after her, even if my father never gave me reason to believe I could. She wrote that she loved me exactly as I was, quiet and careful and watchful, and that the world would eventually learn to value those qualities in me, even if the people closest to me never did. Her voice caught, just slightly, and William reached out to take her hand, not pulling her closer, simply offering the steady presence she had come to rely on without either of them ever nomming it as anything more than comfort. "She was right," Alice said softly. "It only took 19 years and a very stubborn Duke to prove it." William smiled, the first full, unguarded smile Alice had ever seen cross his face, and for a moment, standing together in the quiet workshop with the winter light fading gently outside, neither of them felt any need to say more. That evening, Alice sat by the fire in the study that had become entirely her own, the newly locked box resting on the table beside her, and for the first time since she was 10 years old, she took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, not a letter meant for someone else to read after she was gone, but a record of her own, a beginning rather than an ending. She wrote of the carriage ride that had first carried her away from a house that never saw her. She wrote of a burning corridor and a box worth risking everything to save. She wrote of a duke who had arrived expecting revenge and found, instead, something neither of them had known they were searching for. She folded the new page carefully and placed it inside the box beside her mother's letter, locking it away with the small brass key that hung, from that evening forward, on a ribbon around her wrist, close enough to reach whenever she needed the reminder that some things, once hidden out of fear, could finally be kept simply because they were loved. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Rathmore Manor, soft and steady, covering the grounds in quiet white, while inside, by the warm glow of the fire, the quietest Bennet sister sat beside her husband, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, finally completely seen.